on the clock. Okay, now we're recording. Thanks for bearing with me, everyone. Okay. Where to go? Okay, can everyone see that? Okay, so we're gonna talk about food and literature on a nice morning. So, I mean, what could be better? So, we're gonna read an excerpt from Tender at the Bone by Ruth Reichel and Proust's Swan's Way. Okay, and I just want to start with a little quote. Um, Every cuisine tells a story. Jewish food tells a story of an uprooted, migrating people and their vanished worlds. It lives in the people's minds and has been kept alive because of what it evokes and represents. Okay, so we're gonna start with a little bit of the famous Madeleine scene of the cookie and tea in Proust's Swan's Way. And I'll have that here for everyone to listen to.
Existed other hours than these, but since what I would have then remembered about it would have been furnished me by voluntary memory, the memory of intelligence, and since which that kind of memory shows us of the past preserve nothing of the past itself, I would never have any wish to ponder over this residue of Cambrai. To me, it was in reality all dead. Dead forever? Very possibly. There is a large element of chance in these matters, and a second chance, that of our own death, often prevents us from awaiting for any length of time the favors of the first. I feel that there is much to be said for the Celtic belief that the souls of those whom we have lost are held captive in some inferior being, in an animal, in a plant, in some inanimate object, and so effectively lost to us until the day, which to many never comes, when we happen to pass by the tree, or to obtain possession of the object that forms their prison. Then they start and tremble, and they call us by our name, and as soon as we have recognized their voice, the spell is broken. Delivered by us, they have overcome death, and return to share our life. And so it is with our own past. It is a labor in vain to attempt to recapture it. All the efforts of our intellect must prove futile. The past is hidden somewhere outside the realm, beyond the reach of intellect, in some material object, in the sensation which that material object will give us, which we do not suspect. And as for that object, it depends on chance whether we come upon it or not, before we ourselves must die. Many years had lapsed during which nothing of Cambrai, save what was comprised in the theatre and the drama of my going to bed there, had any existence for me, when one day in winter, as I came home, my mother, seeing that I was cold, offered me some tea, a thing I did not ordinarily take. I declined at first, and then, I don't know why, changed my mind. She sent out for one of those short, plump little cakes called Petite Madeleines, which look as though they had been molded in a fluted scallop of a pilgrim's shell. And
Is she
soon,
frozen?
mechanically, weary
Oh no.
after a dismal day with the prospect of a depressing morrow, I raised to my lips a spoonful of the tea in which I had soaked a morsel of the Madeleine. No sooner had the warm liquid mixed with the crumbs of the cake, touched my palate, than a shudder ran through my whole body. I stopped, intent on the extraordinary changes that were taking place in me. An exquisite pleasure had invaded my senses, but individual, detached, with no suggestion of its origin. At once, the vicissitudes of life had become indifferent to me, its desires innocuous, its brevity illusory. this new sensation having had on me the effect that love has of filling me with a precious essence, or rather, this essence was not in me, it was me. I had ceased to feel mediocre, contingent, mortal. Whence could it have come to me, this all-powerful joy? I sensed that it was connected with the sense of tea and cake, but that it infinitely transcended those savours, could not be of the same nature. Whence did it come? What did it signify? How could I grasp it? I drink a second mouthful, in which I find nothing more than in the first, a third, which gives me rather less than the second. It is time for me to stop. The power of the drink seems to be diminishing. It is clear that the object of my quest, the truth, lies not in me, in it, but in me. The tea has called it up in me, but does not itself understand, and can only repeat indefinitely with a gradual loss of strength the same testimony which I too cannot interpret, though I hope at least to be able to call upon the tea for it again, and to find it there intact.
Okay, so hopefully that I know the text was a little different, but I wanted everyone to be able to have both just in case. Does anyone have any um, first impressions? Um, or at
Dave,
least,
David raised his hand.
oh, David did? Sorry.
Yes.
I'll go. I think it's an amazing short story in itself. And I don't know, Emma, are we going to read it to its end when he sort of discovers where this memory came from?
Um, I've made it shorter for today since we have Ruth Reichel also with
Okay,
a little
right,
video.
because it's very cool. But I
Yeah.
think what's extraordinary is this experience that he describes so exquisitely of remembering something from his past by a material object that all of a sudden raises this almost transcendental feeling, even though you're not sure why and where it comes from. And we've all had that experience, either passing a place where we might have been, maybe in another life, or hearing something or tasting something. So I think, and I love the sort of Celtic notion of when people pass, they reside in objects or materials that one day, all of a sudden, passed by again or touched, they are freed from that imprisonment. I think it's just a magnificent paragraph or short story.
I agree, and you said that beautifully, David. Um, and I agree too. I mean, Proust definitely talks about, he wouldn't say the unconscious, he said, I think, the variable. Oh, no, I can't remember, but different types of memory, and kind of that sense that you can, like Freud came up with at the same time without them either reading each other. But I think it's interesting that two Jewish figures that were both assimilated were considering that subconscious
Mm.
memory and um, thought at the same time. And if anyone else has something to say, you can just unmute yourself and talk.
I was wondering who he was setting free when he was having this experience because of what you had said read prior about the Celtic notion. So I kept thinking, he's going to find out really soon who it is. Who is it? Who is it? You know, I was very curious about that.
It is a beautiful book. I'm sorry I'm not able to play the whole bit, but Lydia Davis has a beautiful translation of Proust's French.
I find it interesting that this is to me, a whole new resurrection concept, that if you walk by whatever it is, a toadstool, and it speaks to you and you recognize the name, that you have that power to bring that person back.
Mm.
I'm game for that.
And if I don't want to cut anyone off, but if you want to move to the next subject, I have a little video to start before we start to consider tender at the bone.
I wanted to add maybe one more thing. The choice of the madeleines is interesting for me, because for me, madeleines are available for special occasions, and it's a choice. You don't, with all that butter, it's not something that's every day.
Yeah, David?
I would just also add to the question that was just asked, where did this memory come from? The end of this chapter or piece, if anyone reads it, after he struggles trying to figure out where this came from to bring it back, he finally gives up. And then all of a sudden he remembers as a child being with his aunt in this house in Cambrai, where she served him tea into which she would crumble madeleines. And all of a sudden, that whole experience comes back to him, the flower garden, the town, everything in its detail, even though he still can't really remember why it is that he had this unbelievable feeling of happiness, but he remembers where it came from, the object.
Yeah, and the Madeleine's central to him, and being from France too.
Mm.
So it's where his family is from. So I'm gonna thank you, David. That transitions well. I'm gonna start another little video. Um, and it's the wrong holiday. I know Rosh Hashanah is coming up, but this is a little piece that I think Hadassah put together with the writer and food historian Michael Twitty, who's really fabulous, and he talks about food traditions in Jewish culture and for Passover and how they're adapted. So I'm going to play this little piece.
Throughout the Seder.
Now, it's going to change from people to people, place to place. If you are from Eastern Europe, Ukraine, Russia, you may still have the custom of putting a potato on the plate for the spring vegetable. Because at that time of year, what else was growing in that part of the world? Some people will have the shank bone of the lamb. Other people are vegan or vegetarian, so they'll put a roasted beet. Haroset will change from place to place. For some people, that's dates and nuts. For some people, it's apples, cinnamon, red wine. For other people, it's a bunch of tropical fruits in a compote mixed together. But the fact of the matter is, there's a lot of room for personal, familial, and cultural identity.
This includes more modern and contemporary additions too, like Miriam's Cup, which was initiated by groups of women in the 1980s to commemorate the role that Moses' sister Miriam played in the Passover story as an effort to be more inclusive of women's narratives. It's filled with water as a reference to Miriam's well, which sustained the Israelites in the desert after they escaped from bondage.
For some people, it's the olive that represents the hope for peace between Israelis and Israeli Arabs and Palestinians.
For others, it's an orange, a tradition initiated by the scholar Susanna Heschel.
A rabbi suggested that lesbian folk were not kosher. You can't bring that part of yourself to this. This is not your space.
A group of students responded by putting a not kosher for Passover crust of bread on their Seder plate as a symbol of inclusion for LGBTQ communities. Heschel replaced it with an orange.
The orange is bright and beautiful and important, and it's not against our laws of Pesach. It's not chametz, and it should be welcome and present and obvious, and a symbol of inclusion. I think that some people have the misunderstanding that you can only do things one way, but of course not understanding that whatever they've inherited has already been changed dozens of times, hundreds of times over thousands of years. What makes things ultimately super kosher, super hechshered, is the fact that we're investing our time, our spirit, our energy, our purpose into creating new meanings, into giving these very ancient forms new life.
The earliest sources for a Seder plate appear in the Mishnah, a compilation of rabbinic laws and practices written between the 1st and 3rd centuries. But we don't know exactly what form it took. One of the earliest forms can be seen in Haggadot from medieval Spain, where the plate is pictured as a basket. Distinct types of Seder plates evolved throughout the world, with different Jewish communities using a range of materials, and an array of regional and personal motifs too. For example, by the 18th century, we see Jews in Germany commissioning Seder plates made of pewter with engraved illustrations depicting family members in their homes. Today, we see a vast range, from traditional to contemporary to super contemporary to homemade. This tiered Seder plate was made between the 18th and 19th centuries in eastern Galicia or western Ukraine. And while many Seder plates only contain the sections for the ceremonial foods, this plate also includes Elijah's cup and shelves for the matzot, so it's an all-in-one item for Passover. All around this crown structure, we see rampant lions, which are present throughout Jewish material culture, especially in synagogues flanking the Ten Commandments on top of the Torah Ark. We see lions in many different cultures as symbols of guardianship and protection. Here, the lions flank the blessings over the ceremonial foods. Their mouths are open, as if biting into the blessings, which is meaningful from a ritual perspective because the whole idea of the Seder is participation in this experience of the Exodus. This piece came to the Jewish Museum from the Jewish community of Danzig in Poland, where, in the spring of 1939, community leaders realized that life in Danzig was becoming increasingly restricted by the Nazis. They undertook a heartbreaking project. The leaders gathered together all the ceremonial objects of the Great Synagogue, which included the collection of a prominent art collector who'd owned the tiered Seder plate, and they sold the works to fund the emigration of those who could still leave. Just as the German army moved into Danzig in 1939, 10 crates were delivered to the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York, then home to the Jewish Museum. The understanding was that if the Jewish community returned to Danzig in 15 years, the objects would be returned. If not, they would stay in New York as educational resources, which they have. The life of this plate is one we see with so much Jewish ceremonial art. These pieces are not only precious works of art, but survivors with important stories to tell.
For me, Pesach is an opportunity to really express my identity. Part of the reason why I love it is because it is a holiday that it talks about liberation from slavery. And I understand that. I feel that on multiple levels. And I understand what Chazal, what the rabbis try to teach us when they say you should personally see yourself as if you were leaving Mitzrayim and pass it on Lador Vador, generation to generation, to your children. And then there's another part of it too, where I have to explain to people that when Passover fell at the end of the Civil War, the day that the surrender occurred, where most African American Southerners who were enslaved actually got their freedom, was also the eve of Pesach that year. So I even have a story about one of my great-great-grandfathers who was a teenager who was actually present at the surrender at Appomattox. And of course, for them, this event was told in terms of the Hebrew Bible. You know, they were expecting the day of Jubilee, they were expecting the day of emancipation. They saw themselves as if they were the Israelites leaving bondage in Egypt. So that for me, in my own family memory and cultural memory, is the idea that, you know, it's more than just symbolic. Like, if it was not for, you know, a strong arm and the outstretched hand of God and the will of the people, I might not be free. And that's what we're constantly reminded during the Haggadah. You might not be free if things hadn't worked out. And so I really feel that, because that wasn't very long ago in American history. And it certainly has its consequences to this day. One of the things that I love to do is every year I try to have, as much as possible, an African American Seder plate. Because I figured, okay, we can also tell the story of African American folks, and those of us who are Jews of African descent or African American heritage, we could use this as our own symbolic place. See, there's no rule against having more than one Seder plate on a table. The beitzah stays the same, the egg. And the reason why is because in Ghana and Nigeria and other places in West Africa, but as well as in the language of Hazal, the rabbis, the egg is a symbol of sacrifice. Karpas, I took off from the practice of having the potato, using a sweet potato. The haroset that I can make for this involves molasses and pecans. And for me, the symbolism there is molasses was a byproduct of sugar. Sugar was the main engine by which the transatlantic slave trade was driven, but also molasses was part of this one of the staple foods of the enslaved. The pecans are there because when we came to this land and other lands and we were in exile, we foraged. We were forced to make something out of the pain we had being separated from our families, our loved ones, and our original cultures. For maror, I have collard green, which also gave us life. And then for Hazeris, red pepper. And red pepper is interesting because, you know, Africa is one of the staple flavors of the West African palate. But there's also a phrase in Wolof, which is one of the major languages of West Africa, especially in Gambia, Senegal, and Mauritania. And they were saying that the truth is a hot pepper. And it's our duty to not only tell the story of our ancestors leaving enslavement, but to live and experience the truth, Seder night. And the chicken bone is the roa. And the reason why, because the Great Migration was African Americans leaving the Jim Crow South for the Northeast, the Midwest, and the West Coast for a better life. Back then, those journeys up north took 12, 13, 14, 15, 16 hours. And you couldn't eat with the white folks. So that was your last valid, authentic taste of home before you became a Chicagoan, before you became a citizen of Oakland, before you became a New Yorker. And that this was your own personal exodus. And typically I will have an orange there because I'm a gay man. And there is a legacy, unfortunately, in our tradition and many traditions of leaving LGBTQ people out. And I've also come to put olive oil for peace between Israelis and Israeli Arabs and Palestinians. The Exodus, Letziat Mitzrayim, is a constant event in Jewish prayer and Jewish thought. You're never allowed to forget that enslavement and the possibility of never leaving that condition is central to the identity of the mishpacha known as the Jewish people. It's not about centering on a culture of victimhood. It's about centering on a culture of redemption. It's about centering on a culture of activism. And it's about centering on a culture of justice, tzedek, tzedek, tidaf nafshi, Justice and righteousness shalt thou pursue. It's nothing to do with how many times you got beaten down. It's about how many times we got up and survived. Hence our own like Jewish phrase, right? They tried to kill us, we won, let's eat, thank God. And that bleeds into my work because ultimately I feel like the work that I've done with African American foodways and talking about what we went through in terms of the Middle Passage and the food coming from Africa to America, from slavery to freedom, is really based on that Haggadah model of really sort of like going through the journey to better the future and looking at your past. I will say this, I don't want to upset anybody or make anybody guffaw, but there's a whole idea that Christians have of keep the Christmas spirit the year round. Every day should be like Christmas in your heart. I think for us, the equivalent is, every day should be like Pesach. The joy of being free, but also the acknowledgement that every day we exist, somebody in the world isn't free, and we need to be the ones to help them become free.
Okay. I know that was a lot all at once. I have some questions to pose, and I think I'll let you look at them. I'll read through it, and then we'll read Ruth Reichel, and then we'll come back and have a discussion. So, one of the questions I had was, what are distinct traditions that you have in your own family? And if they're linked to sense of identity, whether it's Jewish or not, is it specific to your culture, and how so? And if not, what makes it universal to different cultures? Um, and there's a lot to talk about, and I wanted to touch on food writing and food topics in different ways and thoughts. So Ruth Reichel is going to be a funny interlude to this and fun, but if we can kind of keep this in our minds and then come back to it, we'll have a discussion.
The Queen of Mold. Imagine a New York City apartment at 6 in the morning. It is a modest apartment in Greenwich Village. Coffee is bubbling in an electric percolator. On the table is a basket of rye bread, an entire coffee cake, a few cheeses, a platter of cold cuts. My mother has been making breakfast, a major meal in our house, one where we sit down to fresh orange juice every morning, clink our glasses as if they held wine, and toast each other with, "Cheerio, have a nice day." Right now, she is the only one awake, but she is getting impatient for the day to begin, and she cranks WQXR up a little louder on the radio, hoping that the noise will rouse everyone else. But Dad and I are good sleepers. When the sounds of martial music have no effect, she barges into the bedroom and shakes my father awake. "Darling, I need you. Get up and come into the kitchen." My father, a sweet and accommodating person, shuffles sleepily down the hall. He's wearing loose pajamas, and the strand of hair he combs over his bald spot stands straight up. He leans against the sink, holding on to it a little, and obediently opens his mouth when my mother says, "Try this." Later, when he told this story, he attempted to convey the awfulness of what she had given him. The first time he said that it tasted like cat toes and rotted barley, but over the years the description got better. 2 years later, it had turned into pig's snouts and mud, and 5 years later, he had refined the flavor into a mixture of antique anchovies and moldy chocolate. Whatever it tasted like, he said it was the worst thing he had ever had in his mouth, so terrible that it was impossible to swallow, so terrible that he leaned over, spit it into the sink, and then grabbed the coffee pot, put the spout into his mouth, and tried to eradicate the flavor. My mother stood there, watching all this. When my father finally put the coffee pot down, she smiled. "Mm-hmm. Just as I thought. Spoiled." And then she threw the mess into the garbage can and sat down to drink her orange juice. For the longest time, I thought I had made this story up. but my brother insists that my father told it often and with a certain amount of pride. As far as I know, my mother was never embarrassed by the telling, never even knew that she should have been. It was just the way she was, which was taste blind and unafraid of rot. "Oh, it's just a little mold," I can remember her saying on the many occasions she scraped the fuzzy blue stuff off of some concoction before serving what was left for dinner. She had an iron stomach and was incapable of understanding that others did not. This taught me many things. The first was that food could be dangerous, especially to those who loved it. I took this very seriously. My parents entertained a great deal, and before I was 10, I had appointed myself guardian of the guests. My mission was to keep Mom from killing anybody who came to dinner. Her friends seemed surprisingly unaware that they took their lives in their hands each time they ate with us. They chalked their ailments up to the weather, the flu, or one of my mother's more unusual dishes. "No more sea urchins for me," I imagined Bert Langner saying to his wife Ruth after a dinner at our house. "They just don't agree with me." Little did he know that it was not the sea urchins that had made him ill, but that bargain beef my mother had found so irresistible. "I can make a meal out of anything," Mom told her friends proudly. She liked to brag about everything stew, a dish invented while she was concocting a casserole out of a 2-week-old turkey carcass. The very fact that my mother confessed to cooking with 2-week-old turkey says a lot about her. She put the turkey and a half can of mushroom soup into the pot. Then she began rummaging around in the refrigerator. She found some leftover broccoli and added that. A few carrots went in, and then a half carton of sour cream. In a hurry, as usual, she added green beans and cranberry sauce. And then somehow, half an apple pie slipped into the dish. Mom looked momentarily horrified. Then she shrugged and said, "Who knows? Maybe it'll be good." And she began throwing everything in the refrigerator in along with it. Leftover pâté, some cheese ends, a few squishy tomatoes. That night, I set up camp in the dining room. I was particularly worried about the big eaters, and I stared at my favorite people as they approached the buffet, willing them away from the casserole. I actually stood directly in front of Bert Langner, so he couldn't reach the turkey disaster. I loved him, and I knew that he loved food. Unknowingly, I had started sorting people by their tastes. Like a hearing child born to deaf parents, I was shaped by my mother's handicap, discovering that food could be a way of making sense of the world. At first, I paid attention only to taste, storing away the knowledge that my father preferred salt to sugar and my mother had a sweet tooth. Later, I also began to note how people ate and where. My brother liked fancy food and fine surroundings. My father only cared about the company, and Mom would eat anything so long as the location was exotic. I was slowly discovering that if you watched people as they ate, you could find out who they were. Then I began listening to the way people talked about food, looking for clues to their personalities. What is she really saying, I asked myself, when Mom bragged about the invention of her famous corned beef ham. "I was giving a party," she'd begin, "and as usual, I left everything for the last minute." Here she'd look at her audience, laughing softly at herself. I asked Ernst to do the shopping, but you know how absent-minded he is. Instead of picking up a ham, he brought me corned beef. She'd look pointedly at Dad, who would look properly sheepish. "What could I do?" Mom asked. "I had people coming in a couple of hours. I had no choice. I simply pretended it was a ham." With that, Dad would look admiringly at my mother, pick up his carving knife, and start serving the masterpiece. Most mornings, I got out of bed and went to the refrigerator to see how my mother was feeling. You could tell instantly, just by opening the door. One day in 1960, I found a whole suckling pig staring at me. I jumped back and slammed the door, hard. Then I opened it again. I'd never seen a whole animal in our refrigerator before. Even the chickens came in parts. He was surrounded by tiny crab apples. Lady apples, my mother corrected me later, and a whole wreath of weird vegetables. This was not a bad sign. The more odd and interesting things there were in the refrigerator, the happier my mother was likely to be. Still, I was puzzled. The refrigerator in our small kitchen had been almost empty when I went to bed. "Where did you get all this stuff?" I asked. "The stores aren't open yet." Mom patted at her crisp gray hair. Oh, I woke up early and decided to go for a walk. You'd be surprised what goes on in Manhattan at 4 a.m. I've been down to the Fulton Fish Market, and I found the most interesting produce store on Bleecker Street. It was open? Well, not really, but I saw someone moving around, so I knocked. I've been trying to get ideas for the party. Party? What party? Your brother has decided to get married, she said casually, as if I should have somehow intuited this in my sleep. And of course we're going to have a party to celebrate the engagement and meet Shelley's family. My brother, I knew, would not welcome this news. He was 13 years older than I and considered it a minor miracle to have reached the age of 25. I don't know how I survived her cooking. She's a menace to society, he said, as he was telling me about the years when he and Mom were living alone, after she had divorced his father and was waiting to meet mine. Bob went to live with his father in Pittsburgh right after I was born, but he always came home for holidays. When he was there, he always helped me protect the guests, using tact to keep them from eating the more dangerous items. I took a more direct approach. Don't eat that, I ordered my best friend Jeannie as her spoon dipped into one of Mom's more creative lunch dishes. My mother believed in celebrating every holiday. In honor of St. Patrick, she was serving bananas with green sour cream. I don't mind the color, said Jeannie, a trusting soul whose own mother wouldn't dream of offering you an all-orange Halloween extravaganza complete with milk dyed the color of orange juice. Jeannie's mother served the sort of perfect lunches that I longed for. Neat squares of cream cheese and jelly on white bread, bologna sandwiches, Chef Boyardee straight from the can. It's not just food coloring, I said. The sour cream was green to begin with. The carton's been in the refrigerator for months. Jeannie quickly put her spoon down, and when Mom went into the other room to answer the phone, we ducked into the bathroom and flushed our lunches down the toilet. That was great, Mim, said Jeannie when Mom returned. May we be excused, is all I said. I wanted to get away from the table before anything else appeared. Don't you want dessert? Mom asked. Sure, said Jeannie. No, I said. But Mom had already gone to get the cookies. She returned with some strange black lumps on a plate. Jeannie looked at them dubiously, then politely picked one up. I reached for one myself. Oh, go ahead, eat it. They're just Girl Scout mint cookies. She left them on the radiator so all the chocolate melted off, but they won't kill you. As we munched our cookies, Mom asked idly, What do you girls think I should serve for Bob's engagement party? You're not going to have the party here, are you? I asked, holding my breath. Mom had moments of decorating inspiration that usually died before the project was finished. The bathroom was my mother's greatest decorating feat. One day she had decided, on the spur of the moment, to install gold towels, a gold shower curtain, and a gold rug. They were no problem. But painting all the porcelain gold was a disaster. It almost immediately began peeling off the sink, and it was years before any of us could take a bath without emerging slightly gilded. No, said Mom. We're having the party in the country. We have more room in Wilton, and we need to welcome Shelley into the family properly. I pictured our small, shabby summer house in the woods. Wilton is only an hour from New York, but in 1960 it was still very rural. My parents had bought the land cheaply and designed the house themselves. Since they couldn't afford an architect, they had miscalculated a bit, and the downstairs bedrooms were very strangely shaped. Dad hardly knew how to hold a hammer, but to save money he had built the house himself with the aid of a carpenter. He was very proud of his handiwork. He was even prouder of our long, rutted, meandering driveway. I didn't want to cut down a single tree, he said, when people asked why it was so crooked. I loved the house, but I was slightly embarrassed by its unpainted wooden walls and unconventional character. Why can't we have the party in a hotel? Nonsense, said Mom. It will be much nicer to have it at home. So much more intimate. I'd like them to see how we live, find out who we are. Great, I said under my breath to Jeannie. That'll be the end of Bob's engagement, and a couple of the relatives might die, but who worries about little things like that? Just thinking about it made me nervous. I've got to stop this party. How? Asked Jeannie. I didn't know. I had 4 months to figure it out. My best hope was that my mother's mood would change before the party took place. This was not unrealistic. My mother's moods were erratic. But March turned into April, and April into May, and Mom was still buzzing around. The phone rang constantly, and she was feeling great. She cut her gray hair very short and actually started wearing nail polish. She lost weight and bought a whole new wardrobe. Then she and Dad took a quick cruise to the Caribbean. "We booked passage on a United Fruit freighter," she said to her friends. "So much more interesting than a conventional cruise." When asked about the revolutions that were then rocking the islands, she had a standard response. The bomb in the hotel lobby in Haiti made the trip much more interesting. When they returned, she threw herself into planning the party. I got up every morning and looked hopefully into the refrigerator. Things kept getting worse. Half a baby goat appeared. Next there was cactus fruit. But the morning I found the box of chocolate-covered grasshoppers, I decided it was time to talk to Dad. "The plans are getting more elaborate." "Yes," said Dad. Parties didn't much interest him. "It's going to be a disaster," I announced. "Your mother gives wonderful parties." He was remarkably blind to my mother's failings, regularly announcing to the world that she was a great cook. He beamed when someone mentioned my mother's interesting dishes, and considered it a compliment when they said, "I've never tasted anything quite like that before." And, of course, he never got sick. "Did you know that she's planning it as a benefit for UNICEF?" "Really? Isn't that nice? It'll all work out. Your mother is a very smart woman. She has a PhD." It was hard to get mad at my father, who was as baffled by my mother's moods as I was. My father was an intellectual who had escaped his wealthy German Jewish family by coming to America in the 20s. He was a book designer who lived in a black and white world of paper and type. Books were his only passion. Dad, I think, enjoyed Mom's energy, but then he could always escape to the office, which is what he did now. Disgusted, I called my brother. Bob lived uptown in a fancy apartment and had as little to do with my parents as he could decently get away with. "She's planning to make my engagement party a benefit? You mean she expects Shelley's family to pay to attend?" I hadn't quite considered that aspect, but I could see his point. "I guess so, but that's not the part that worries me. Can you imagine Mom cooking for over 100 people in the middle of summer? What if it's a really hot day?" Bob groaned, and I asked, "Can't you get called away on business?" Unfortunately, my mother was not the least bit fazed when informed that my brother might not be in town. "The party's not for you," she said to Bob. "It's for Shelley's family." "But Mom," said Bob, "you can't ask them to buy tickets to the party." "Why not? I think it's just disgusting the way people who have so much forget about those who are less fortunate. I can't believe I have such a selfish, thoughtless son." And Mom slammed down the phone. So there we were, 150 people invited to lunch on the lawn, a representative from UNICEF, and photographers promised from all the newspapers. In one of her more grandiose moments, Mom wrote her old friend Bertrand Russell in Wales and asked him to come speak. Fortunately, he was nearing his 90th birthday and declined. But he did send 100 copies of his most recent anti-war booklet, a sort of fairy tale printed on gold paper. It was called History of the World in Epitome, for use in Martian infant schools, and it was very short. The last page was a picture of a mushroom cloud. Mom pointed out that they were autographed. "These will make wonderful favors." She was so pleased, she sent out a few more invitations. "What are you going to serve?" I asked. "Do you have any ideas?" she replied. "Yes, hire a caterer." Mom laughed, as if I had made a joke. I suggested that she hire someone to help cook and serve, but she didn't seem to think that was necessary. "We can do that ourselves. Can't you get your friends to help?" "No," I said, "I can't." But I did call Jeannie in the city and asked her if she could come out for the week. She thought my mother was exciting, and I needed moral support. As the party approached, things got worse and worse. Mom went on cleaning binges that left the house messier when she was done than when she started, and Jeannie and I went around behind her desperately stuffing things back into closets to create some semblance of order. Mom mowed half the lawn. We mowed the other half. One morning, Mom went to a wholesale food company and came back honking her horn loudly, her car filled to the brim. Jeannie and I rushed out to unload 50 pounds of frozen chicken legs, 10 pounds of frozen lump crab meat, industrial-sized cans of tomato and split pea soup, 25-pound sacks of rice, and 2 cases of canned spiced peaches. "This must be the menu," I said to Jeannie. "I bet she's going to make that awful quick soup she thinks is so great. You know, it's in all the magazines. You mix a can of tomato soup with a can of split pea soup, add a little sherry, and top it with crab meat. Then I guess she's going to cook these millions of chicken legs on top of rice." I was surprised and relieved when Mom ordered a giant cake from the local bakery. That left only the hors d'oeuvres. I wondered what she had up her sleeve. The next day, I found out. Jeannie and I were playing croquet, but we put down our mallets when Mom's horn started and watched the car speed through the trees, leaving billows of dust in its wake. We ran out to see what she had dragged home. "Horn and Hardart was having a sale," Mom announced triumphantly, pointing to the boxes around her. They were filled with hundreds of small cartons. It looked promising. "It's almost like getting it catered," I said happily to Jeannie as we toted the boxes inside. My happiness was short-lived. When I began opening the cartons, I found that each contained something different. "What are you going to do with it?" I asked. "Why, serve it," Mom said. "In what?" "Big bowls." "But all you have is hundreds of things to put in little bowls." I began ripping the tops off the cartons. "Look, this one is potato salad. This one is coleslaw. Here's some sliced ham. Nothing matches." "Don't worry," said Mom. "I'm sure we can make something out of all of this. After all, everything in it is good." "Yes," I muttered to Jeannie, "and by the time it gets served, everything in it will be 4 days old. It will be a miracle if it's not moldy." "I think it would be better if it was," said practical Jeannie. "If people see mold, they won't eat it." "Pray for rain," I said. Unfortunately, when I woke up on the day of the party, there was not a cloud in the sky. I pulled the covers over my head and went back to sleep, but not for long. "Nobody sleeps today," Mom announced. "It's party day." Some of the food had acquired a thin veneer of mold, but Mom blithely scraped it off and began mixing her terrible Horn and Hardart mush. "It's delicious," she cried, holding out a spoonful. It wasn't. Fortunately, it looked even worse than it tasted. I thought the chicken legs were a little dubious, too. In order to get them all cooked, we had started 2 days earlier, and the refrigerator couldn't hold them all. But they glistened invitingly, and the oven-baked rice looked fine. We spooned the peaches into Mom's big glass bowls, and they looked beautiful. I wasn't very happy about this soup. Mom had left the crab meat out of the freezer to defrost for 2 days, and even she didn't like the way it was smelling. "I think I'll just add a little more sherry," she kept saying as she poured in bottles of the stuff. "People will get drunk on the soup," I said. "Fine," she said. "Then maybe they'll donate more to UNICEF." My brother Bob arrived, took one look at the rickety chairs on our uneven lawn, and headed straight for the bar. Mom had hired some local high school boys to be bartenders, and they were pouring whiskey as if it were Coke. "You've got to stay sober," I said to Bob. "You've got to make sure that nobody in Shelley's family eats the soup, and they should probably watch out for the chicken, too." Bob had another drink. My memories of the party are mercifully blurred, but a yellowed clipping from the Norwalk Hour tells part of the story. My mother looks radiantly into the camera beneath a headline reading, "Wilton Family Hosts Benefit for UNICEF." A family photograph of me handing a check to a grinning official in front of a sign that says Security Council in both French and English tells another part of the tale. But my brother owns the end of the story. 35 years later, his children can still make him turn green by asking, "Remember the time Nana Mimi poisoned everyone?" "Oh," he moans, "don't remind me. It was awful. First she extorted money from them. Then she gave out those anti-bomb favors. It was the early 60s, for Christ's sake, and these were conservative businessmen and housewives." But the worst thing was the phone calls. They kept coming all night long. Nobody felt good. 26 of them actually ended up in the hospital having their stomachs pumped. What a way to meet the family. I do remember the phone ringing while we were still cleaning up. Mom was exulting in the photographer's flashbulbs and saying for what seemed like the 47th time, "Look how much money we raised." She picked up the receiver. "Yes?" Then her voice drooped with disappointment. Who doesn't feel well? There was a long silence. Mom ran her hand through her chic, short coiffure. Really? All of them? She slumped a little as her bright red fingernails went from her hair to her mouth. Then her back straightened and her head shot up. Nonsense. We all feel fine. And we ate everything. Grandmothers. I had 3 grandmothers, and none of
Okay. Hopefully everyone enjoyed that. I'm gonna just show the questions one more time, and then we can open up for discussion about anything about Reichel, Proust, or video. What are distinct traditions that your family has? If they're linked to a sense of identity, is it specific to your culture, and how so? And what makes it different? And if not, what makes it universal? So I'm going to. Okay. Anyone can open up the discussion and talk. Sorry, I'm trying to get out of.
Abraham. I particularly appreciate Michael Twitty pointing out the evolution of Seder plates, and it's ongoing, and it's cultural, it's regional, it's, all these changes. We tend to think that these things are fixed, and only because it's our personal experience. And I'm reminded, I have a sister who's older than I am, who insists that Passover wine must be in, quote, in Yiddish, and she's a Rebbitzin, Reut and Zies. And I celebrate that it's not that anymore, that in my childhood, that's all there was, Manischevis. But now you have a selection of very, very fine wines for the Seder, and that's a wonderful evolution.
Wonderful. There we go.
I related to the woman who was a bad cook. I have a grandmother, for different reasons, she was a terrible cook. And the reason why she was a terrible cook was because she volunteered to help people who were coming into the country. She was fluent in French and Arabic and English. And so people would call her as they would arrive at the docks, or they had to translate, how she needed to help them translate with some bureaucratic form or interview. So she would get up, and this was in a community that was very proud of their culinary skills. The women were very proud, and it was a very important function. But she would get up and start cooking, and if a call came in to help, she would just turn all the fires up really high and cook things really fast, mostly burning them, so that she could get out of the house and go help people. So that's my story of a grandmother who was a terrible cook.
Love that. And I'm going to read from the chat. Jeannie wrote something in. Not sure about family identity, but the stuffed cabbage was clearly a family recipe. My family on all sides was from Eastern Europe. Maybe someone else today knows something about stuffed cabbage. P.S. My grandmother was an excellent cook, cooking everything from scratch as I am today.
I can add to that part about stuffed cabbage. My mother used to make stuffed cabbage fairly regularly. And when I first moved out and set up housekeeping, I would also make stuffed cabbage until I realized that it was way too much work and that I was always burning myself trying to separate the leaves of a whole boiled head of cabbage. But it makes me want to try it again sometime this winter when it's cold out again.
My grandmother also made, we called it prakas, and it was phenomenal. My mother always said, oh, the juice tasted like wine. She would put raisin, I guess maybe some of you can, right? So the raisins and the rice, the sweet and the savory was in there. And cooking was really my grandmother's, from my perspective as a child, a huge part of her identity. She would make something different for each of us when we came. She would never sit down at the table and eat with us, but she was busy in the kitchen, right? So one would get a Cornish hen and one would get a lamb chop and one would get, you know, whatever we wanted. And there's a bittersweetness to the story in that as she aged and was less able to cook, I did feel this sort of longing that she had and sort of a sense of loss in terms of where she fit in, you know, to the family. And then my mother always said we skip generations. So I became like, I'm garlic cloves, my mother is garlic salt. So my grandmother was from scratch. My mother went processed fast, and there's like a lot of cultural pieces of that. And then I sort of picked up my grandmother's tendencies. So just thanks for bringing all that up. I brought up my nanny, Esther Rose, and felt good to think about her too. Thanks.
Well, in our family, I'm all about tradition. So I probably mostly use the same menu for years and years and years, which I find is very easy as well as comforting. But one thing that I have always made is an apple cake, not a Jewish apple cake. It's more like a tart, an apple tart. And I've made this since my children were very young. And so one time I had made this cake and somebody asked my daughter, you know, what nationality was this cake? I don't know if she said German or Polish or whatever, to which my daughter responded, oh no, it's Jewish. To her, it was a Jewish cake because we always ate it on Rosh Hashanah.
That's a good point. And there's a wonderful article, I can link it, about Jewish food. And people debate what makes Jewish food Jewish or if there is a culture. But I thought a really interesting theme that I had in the quote before was the idea of migration and the kind of diaspora, and especially the idea of memory being connected to that. And usually it was the last place the family had been that currently felt like the food culture, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, my mother used to make a nut cake with matzo meal. That was delicious. It was like a bun cake. And she used to make one for every member of the extended families, aunts and uncles and everybody else. I don't know how many she made. And we'd sit down, pass over, and the cake would be there. And we'd take a small slice and be talking. Then we'd take another small slice and we'd still be talking. Before we knew it, the whole cake was almost gone. And I think one time after my mother passed, Diane, with my brother, decided to make the nut cakes. Oh no, it was before that, when she went to Brazil that time. And she said she made two at a time. And what she would do it was with the egg whites. And you'd beat the egg whites. And that was part of the thing. So Diane and my brother decided 2 at a time. So they made 24 egg whites. And it was all over the kitchen.
If you had seen Lucy and Ethel with either the chocolates or with, I don't know, something with soap coming from everywhere. It was one of their crazy, it was like that. There were beaten egg whites, as Saul said, literally all over the kitchen, in big roasting pans, on the floor, on us, it was everywhere. It was really a comedy scene. But we had fun, and we made one cake.
Yes, and then when my mother got back, she said, oh no, you make one cake at a time.
Put it in the oven, and then do the other one. 24 egg whites beaten. You could just imagine.
Our family tradition was my Aunt Janelle and my Uncle Sanford would make hundreds of blintzes every time we had a family event. They had a whole routine where they had like a production line on their countertops, and they would make these blintzes and freeze them so that when we got together, we could eat them. And they always cooked them on the grill. So they would thaw them out, and we'd all be in the yard at these long tables, and they would be grilling the blintzes, and we would be waiting our turn to be able to get our blintz. And just before she died of pancreatic cancer. We had gone into Cleveland to visit her. She gave us a batch of frozen blintzes, and we got snowed in at the Cleveland airport, and I had to have the airport hotel put it in the freezer. And then the next morning they couldn't find it, and we were, in the shuttle waiting for them to find the blintzes. And we finally got them, and we came home and we put them in the freezer, and she died, and we were never able to eat the blintzes. I mean, they stayed there for years, but we just couldn't get ourselves to eat them because it meant another final step with Aunt Janelle.
I find myself thinking about the traditional Shabbat dinners, and I come from a time when you couldn't get packaged stuff. My mother would go to the fish store in North Marshall Street in Philadelphia and pick out the fish from this big pool, and it would be a carp, of course, because that would be the cheapest. And that really goes back to traditions. It's the cheapest foods that we would make into standard dishes. And this is what we expected. It was very regular.
Brisket used to be cheap, and now it is not.
We're making a cookbook right now from my mother, who's a wonderful cook. She's 95, who claims all of her recipes came from her mother. And we've asked everybody to collect those recipes that they might have of my mother's. And I've been assembling all of them, and I found two curious things that could not have come from my grandmother. One is my mother's own Chinese dish called Me Too Pork. That would not have come from my grandmother. And the other is my mother's secret. She collects this sweet duck sauce from Chinese restaurants and uses it for any number of her recipes. So
well, you would
anyway, it's been an interesting exercise collecting her recipes.
We had perhaps still have a tradition in my family of making something called pork stuffing. And we made that every Thanksgiving. I've never found any other family who makes this, but the dish was passed down from my grandparents whose parents came from Germany. And it consisted of boiling up a pork butt on the stove for as many hours as you could do that, and then shredding that and pouring the juice and the pork over bread cubes, and then adding cloves, cinnamon, ginger, and allspice, and stirring that all up, and then stuffing the turkey with it and baking the extra. And you either loved it or hated it. And I don't think anyone in the family is still making it. We all ask each other. One of my brothers made it, but I think it might be unfortunately a lost tradition. I think Louise had it once, didn't she? No, she looked at it once. It's not that pretty.
I don't know. Maybe it's time to almost wrap up. But did anyone have any thoughts? I don't know, just about any of the pieces, or about maybe what makes something a food Jewish or not, or the idea of adapting over time or memory.
Well, I was just thinking, I think, Ted, and what you were sharing. So, my father came from an Orthodox family, but my mother came from a conservative family, but they were not kashrut. However, I grew up and we never ate pork, right? Never ate shellfish, and yet there was not an observance, right? A religious observance, and nobody said they were kosher. And I was just thinking about that, right? The way certain choices come down generationally that are not necessarily identified in terms of practice.
I have one more story. When my father passed away, a couple of years later, my mother remarried, and she remarried this really very wonderful guy. And they went on a honeymoon to Acapulco, and he wasn't kosher, but she was. And she kept a kosher house and everything else. And one day when they were having dinner, she said, "Sarah, try a piece of meat. Nothing can happen wrong. Just try a piece of meat." And she tried it. The next day there was an earthquake, and I think there was a mild tornado. She said, "You see, God is telling me I should stay kosher."
I would just like to say thank you, Emma, for all you've taught us. And I sure can't wait to see what you're going to learn in the next year or so, and come back and teach us again.
Yes.
And good luck to you.
We really appreciate all that you've done, Emma.
Thank you, Emma.
Thank you, Emma.
Good luck.
Thank you, Emma.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
Emma.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks. I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of their weekend. It's been such a pleasure to. I'll definitely see you at other events online or not, but the community means so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Emma.
Thank you, Emma.
Thank you, and happy early Rosh Hashanah. Bye, everybody. Bye.